All right, this is our first video lecture where we will cover the first 4 artworks in our 250 curriculum. What I have asked you to do for this video while you're taking notes is to utilize our graphic organizers. You should have picked 4 up in class for the first 4 pieces, or they are also posted to our classroom. I am going to go slowly through these first 4 artworks, giving you the category where you will write the information down so you can become familiar with classifying the information. The big pieces of information that you need to pay attention to are form, content, context, and function. Those are the big ones that are going to come up in essays and things like that. Just going over these categories again really quickly. Form, those are what elements or principles of design are being used in the artwork. So color, shape, value, texture, line, and space. It could also include things like use of perspective or different techniques that have been utilized in drawing or painting to create the artwork. So that all goes under form. Material is just what sorts of mediums are being utilized to make the artwork, as well as techniques. If there's a special way that the materials were used to achieve the artwork, that would go in materials and techniques. Content. Now this one is the tricky one. Content could sometimes fall under form. It could also sometimes fall under context. Content is the subject matter of the artwork, what you're seeing in the piece. It could also include iconography, symbols, and also the story behind the work. So for things like Greek mythological stories that are being depicted in an artwork, that would sort of fall under content. The story behind the work, the story the work is trying to tell. Context has to do with the place, the audience, the site that the artwork was made during, what was going on in the world around the artist when this artwork was being made, why is the artwork significant to the time frame it was being made. All of that will go under context. It could also have to do with, in prehistoric artworks, the time that the artwork was discovered. And then function and purpose, what was the object used for? Why was it made? Patron may also fall under function and purpose. Who commissioned the work? Who wanted the artwork made? What was it made to do? Some other things I'm going to be pointing out that are important as well: innovation and change, what's new about the artwork, and also convention and tradition. What are some things from past artworks that are being carried on throughout this new artwork? Theme, I'll also make mention of, and comparison to another artwork, you can kind of fill that out as we start to look through these together. So I would like you to utilize these first 4 graphic organizer charts to help you fill in the information. If you need to go beyond the small box, which for things like context and content, I typically would need to, you can turn over the page and continue on the back. All right, so our first work, this is our oldest artwork in our chronological order. For our first box identification, these are the Apollo 11 stones. The Apollo 11 stones were found in the Huns Mountains of Namibia. These are made of charcoal on quartzite, is the type of stone. And the year on this is around 25,500 to 25,300 BCE, which puts us into the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age time frame. So again, we'll come back to form. There's not a lot of formal properties being used, but we will actually let's start with a context box. The Apollo 11 stones were found buried under layers of sediment in 1969. by a team of archaeologists led by the German archaeologist W.E. Wendt. The spelling of that last name is W-E-N-D-T, Wendt. They were found in a rock shelter in the Huns Mountains of Namibia. And you can see on these two maps where the Apollo 11 cave was located. Here's an image of that valley where the rock shelter was located. The first fragment that was found was the front half, the piece on the left-hand side. And it was named the Apollo 11 stones in the Apollo 11 rock shelter because it was discovered right after hearing about the successful NASA landing on the moon, the Apollo 11 landing on the moon. So that is where the stones and the shelter get its name from. About 3 years later, the second fragment was found, and that's that right half, the back half of this animal. And there were about 7 fragments found in total. Some depicted traces of animal figures, but it's not possible to really tell the exact age of these stones. We have sort of a ballpark here. Continuing with the context, the rock shelter was an active site of ongoing human settlement during the Middle Stone Age. Stone artifacts at the site show evidence that the tools had been transported across long distances. So the type of rocks that were found in these stone shelters were not native to this area. They were actually native to, I believe some were native to Northern Africa, and so forth, different areas across long distances. So it shows that this group of peoples traveled. I'm going to pause on the context for a moment, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the content of this image. So what we're seeing here, this piece, it's hard to tell, from this image because we don't have any scale, but this is actually a hand-sized slab of stone. And you can make out the faint markings of, it seems to be a body of an animal drawn on the surface of this stone in charcoal. This was once a complete slab, so it would have been one piece. And the animal that we're seeing here, if you look very closely, it's hard to identify what this form would have been. We see what resembles to be a feline type body and head. But if you look closely, there's something sort of strange about these back legs. They're believed to be human hind legs. They're very thin. You seem to have this little sort of foot shape, primitive foot of a human. Also barely visible at the head, you may notice very faintly these 2 lines that jut off of the head. These are believed to be the slightly curved horns of what was most likely an oryx or a large grazing antelope type of animal. The last thing that is a little peculiar about this animal, this composite animal, is found right here on the underbelly. It resembles the sexual organs of a bovid, which would be an animal like a cow, a buffalo, this sort of triangular shaped protrusion that comes off of the underbelly. So what we are seeing here is actually a combination of multiple different animals. This is known as a therianthrope. I'm going to spell that for you. Therianthrope. And what a therianthrope is part human and part animal. So think centaur, think a satyr from Greek mythology. Those are common therianthropes that we're familiar with. And so looking at this small piece of rock with this composite animal human drawn on top of it, art historians posit that perhaps, and this could go with context, this piece could go with function, perhaps this served some sort of a religious or supernatural function connected to a complex system of shamanistic beliefs. The inclusion of this part animal, part human being could be indicative of some sort of religious significance, which also leads art historians and archaeologists to believe that this may be the site of some sort of religious ritual significance for these early peoples. In the Middle Stone Age period, man was a nomadic hunter-gatherer, which would move to find food and shelter. And so that may give us reason that the piece is small and handheld. It may also connect to that theory that this may be a religiously significant piece. It's something that they decided was important enough to take with them on their travels to find food and shelter. So that could even further provide proof or evidence for this being a religiously significant or an early religious piece. What's really interesting about this work and what could be considered an innovation is that this is a form that was drawn from as much of the imagination as it was drawn from observation, meaning this wouldn't be something that a person would see in real life. They would see different parts of this animal, but they've used their imagination to put this creature together. And so it shows that the artist possessed a new and unique capacity for symbolic thought and imaginative thought. This would go under your innovation and change. We've bounced around a little bit, but we're now going to go up to form, and I'd like to just talk about the way that the animal was drawn on the rock surface. This is something that we're going to become familiar with as we look at our prehistoric art. You'll notice that we're seeing a profile view of the animal. We have all four legs, we have the side of the head, the full side view of the body. So we're seeing that profile view of the animal, which is very common in prehistoric figurative art or art of animals and people figurative art. Something that is a little bit different about the profile view, however, is instead of seeing just the antlers from the side where you might only see one set of antlers, we're seeing both antlers shown. This is what comes to be known as a twisted view. And we'll see some examples of this with our next piece. But this is very common in prehistoric art. They're trying to give you the most information about the creature or animal as they can in a single view. So they're letting you know exactly what the antlers might look like from a frontal view, so that if you were to, if this were a realistic animal, an animal that you would see in real life, it would give you an idea of what those antlers would look like as they're coming towards you rather than from a profile. And just a term for our glossary, a small-scale prehistoric piece of art that is mobile and portable is known as art mobilier, M-O-B-I-L-I-E-R. That's the term for a piece of art that is small and portable, specifically prehistoric art that is small and portable. So that's something to just highlight, put down in your glossary in the back of your notebook so that you have it. Moving on to our next work. This may be a familiar piece to many of you. This is for our identification box. This is the Hall of the Bulls, found in the Lascaux caves in France. This piece dates to around 16,000 to 14,000 BCE. It is 11 feet and 6 inches long, and it is charcoal and ochre on stone. So we're going to just start with our form to kind of piggyback off of what we talked about in the last piece. The animals, if you look at them, are all rendered in a twisted perspective. So we're seeing again the bodies in full profile, but the horns are in frontal view for things like the bison and bulls and things like that. The images are somewhat entirely linear, meaning we have a line drawn to define, a contour line rather, drawn to define the outer edges of the animal's body. In some cases though as well, we do have a solid color describing the animal as well, with these horses down at the bottom, the horse here. You have that outline, but also filled in with color. So we're seeing a few different techniques being used in the rendering of these animals. I'm going to give you a little bit of context. The Lascaux Caves are one of almost 350 similar sites, most of them found in the south of France and the north of Spain. And these caves would have housed both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, whom coexisted in this region for about 30,000. They coexisted in the region about 30,000 years ago. What we're seeing in these images, this is the entrance to the caves here. And looking at the diagram, just after the entrance of the caves, you would come into the Hall of the Bulls, which is where we're going to focus on. There are other halls with artworks found within them, specifically Chamber of Felines down here as well. Life for people at this time was very short and very difficult. Resources were especially scarce in cold climates like Europe. Within the caves, archaeologists found hundreds of stone tools. And looking, I think at this next slide will show it. Yes, looking at this slide, there were also identified these holes in the walls here, here, here. Down here, there's a few. That may have supported tree limbs that would act as scaffolding for the artists to climb on top of so that they could reach these higher areas of the ceiling. Different rooms, as we looked at in the last slide here. Here's a bunch of different rooms. They mostly contained engravings and different overlapping forms, and seemed to just exhibit the pure process of drawing and repetitive drawing, which maybe were ritually significant for the makers, but we're not quite sure of the purpose of these repetitive layered drawings in these various rooms. Similarly, we're not exactly sure what the intended function of the Hall of the Bulls were. If we look at, can go into our box number 6, the intended function and purpose. One possibility was communication, showing others the various types of animals in the area. Another theory revolves around the Hall of Bulls being large enough to fit about 50 people. And so it is believed that it could possibly have played a role in what was known as hunting magic. Hunting magic may have been this belief that, or may have been connected to a belief that through making these paintings, it would allow the hunters to overpower their prey. And so tying into that hunting magic, you would have to create images of the animals you were hunting. So that could be a possibility as well. It also may communicate a narrative or a story, which would be something very innovative for our early artists. And I'll show you some examples of how that may tie in just a moment. I'd like to look a little closer at some of the images here. So we're going to go over to our content box. Looking at just this little piece of the wall, we see horses. We also see some deer located here with these antlers, some bison, elk, not pictured here. A few lions were found in this hall, as well as we're going to see in later images a rhino and also a bear that I don't have pictured. So it acts as almost an encyclopedia of the area's large prehistoric wildlife. Art historians also found, and you can see it better in this slide here, these abstract repetitive marks and dots, as well as lines that were found in a variety of configurations that they think may add another meaning, sort of an astrological meaning to the paintings as well. I'd like to show you one of the most unique pieces found in the caves here. Pictured here, we have a bison all the way to our far right. The bison seems to have sort of bristled fur, like it's, agitated. And in front of the bison, we have what appears to be a humanoid figure. Below the humanoid figure, we have a bird sitting perched on some sort of a stake. And then here on the left, we have a rhinoceros and some of these abstract marks behind the rhinoceros's tail, some of those abstract lines here, a line here as well. This piece, if we look closely at the bison, we also notice some sort of a wound where what appears to be the entrails of the bison falling out of that wound here. So this piece is interpreted as being perhaps a hunting scene. And so that ties into our sort of narrative. It's a telling of a story of this hunt to slay the bison. But what's really interesting, if we look a little closer at this humanoid figure, it seems to have what has been interpreted as the head of a bird. And so it's been interpreted as being some sort of religious shaman, or maybe tying into, again, that sort of hunting magic perspective on this artwork. But it also appears, which may also tie into that hunting magic, that the bison has just been injured by the human, or even possibly the rhino that's just off to the side here. It's unclear from the visuals that were given exactly who has injured the bison. I just want to go back. I've used this word a couple times, and I want to make sure that we give you the definition for it. The word shaman. A shaman, which comes up in a lot of our earlier religion, is a type of priest or healer that was considered to have powers. And those powers involved the ability to communicate with spirits in the other world. And so just to make sure that you have that in your glossary of terms. So this sort of supports our theory that this was maybe intended to be some sort of a narrative showing maybe the hunting magic taking effect and working, where we have our shaman going out on a hunt, slaying a bison. Another theory, though, that is very interesting that involves some of those abstract marks that I spoke about and kind of ties into that astrological element, is that the dots and some of these lines correspond to star placement and different constellations, such as Taurus found here. And on the side, you can see a little map of the placement of those stars in the constellation Taurus, the Pleiades. Again, here a little cutout to show where the Pleiades, how the Pleiades are arranged in Orion's belt. So it's believed by some that the caves could have been a sort of prehistoric planetarium where early peoples charted the stars. It's also seen that perhaps the eyes, oops, let me go back to here. The eyes and the dots here chart a map of the sky with the eyes of the bull, the birdman and the bird all representing the three prominent stars Vega, Deneb, and Altar. And together they form the summer triangle, which is the three brightest stars that are high overhead during the summer months in the northern hemisphere. So these 3 points here forming that summer triangle. Again, these theories are all created by taking in what visual evidence we have, what evidence we have from the area around the site, and kind of making an inference using that evidence. We don't have concrete answers on any of this. So for convention and tradition, again, just that twisted profile view that we saw in the last piece. And for innovation and change, we are seeing some sort of narrative happening here with the humanoid figure, the shaman figure slaying this bull. And so that depiction of an action and a reaction in art for the first time in our early art history. We're halfway there almost. Our next piece is the camelid sacrum in the shape of a canine. This is found in prehistoric Mexico. I'm going to try to pronounce the area, the Tequixquiac area of Mexico. This is from about 14,000 to 7,000 BCE. And this is created using animal bone. So moving over to our form box, it was a really common practice in prehistoric times for the shape of a natural form, like the sacrum bone, to suggest the subject matter for the carver. On this next slide, I'm going to show you a sacrum bone. So this is a sacrum bone here. The sacrum bone is a large triangular bone that's found at the base of the spine. And a camelid, which is in the title of the piece, that was a now extinct animal that would have been part of a camel, llama, the alpaca family. And so you can see how the shape of the camelid bone the camelid sacrum bone rather, has really lent itself to the final shape of the piece, this canine dog-like shape, head shape that the piece takes on. This was found buried at a depth of about 40 feet in 1870 when an engineer was working on a drainage project in the area. The authenticity of it was at first questionable because of a lack of scientific evidence from the find spot, which was where it's pretty self-explanatory, the spot where the object was at first found. But the language and iconography of the area suggests that this piece was important in Mesoamerican culture. Specifically, the sacrum bone was very important in Mesoamerican culture as it related to sacredness, resurrection, and also fire. There isn't actually direct evidence that proves this, however, because of, again, we don't have any written, verbiage from back then that gives us an exact idea of what was going on at the time. For content, we don't have a lot. Just I would make note of the canine dog-like shape of the sculpture. For intended function and purpose, again, we're going on inferences based on our visual cues that are available to us. One interpretation kind of took a look at the piece through a lens of later Mesoamerican cultures. The sacrum is seen as sacred, and that some American Indian languages named that bone with the word referring to its sacredness and the divine power of the reproductive organs that are located near the sacrum bone at the base of the spine. And so, considering how important that reproductive and fertility element was and still is or continues to be throughout art and throughout culture, it could have been sacred for the purpose of reproduction and fertility. For our innovation and change box and convention and tradition, I would just like you to make note under convention and tradition that using the shape of a natural form to suggest the subject matter of this sculpture was a common practice at this time. And some themes, spiritual, reproductive, perhaps religious, those could all be possible themes of this piece. And here's our final piece for today. This is, I'm sorry about the quality of this image. I think I have a slightly better one on the next slide. This is Running Horned Woman. This was found in a rock shelter in Algeria from 6000 to 4000 BCE, and it is pigment on rock. We're going to jump right into context. This was found in 1933 to 1940 within the canyons of Tassili, Niger. It was a hard-to-reach plateau in the Algerian section of the Sahara Desert. Actually, here's an image of where that rock shelter was, and you can see it's very craggy, a lot of cliffs here, very difficult to get into this rock shelter. This area, however, contained about 15,000 human and animal figure paintings and engravings. The Tuareg indigenous peoples of the area had known of the artworks long before archaeologists from 1933 and 40 had gone and discovered them. But it was so secluded and difficult to access that archaeologists concluded it most likely had been part of a sanctuary. This was the most beautiful and finished and most original work found at the site. On the left is what the actual image looks like in the rock shelter. On the right is a artist's, rendering of the image so that you can see it a little better. Looking at, actually, let's talk about the function and purpose, since we mentioned the location of it being so difficult to get to, and kind of posited that perhaps it was part of a sanctuary. It's believed that perhaps this figure was maybe a priestess or a goddess of a cult that was perhaps foreshadowing or where Isis later in Egypt is derived from. And looking at some of the visual cues found on the figure, going over to our content, we see the silhouette of a woman in perspective, sort of a twisted perspective again, with seeing the full frontal view of the horns, who appears to be running with one leg slightly flexed, just touching the ground. The other is in the air high, as if it would normally, or raised high as if she were in motion, excuse me. We also see, looking in this image, it's a little easier, a fringe that sort of falls from the knee to the feet. We also see a belt going across her midsection, as well as her arms outstretched with that fringe around her bicep area. She wears horns on top of her head. And the horizontal area between the horns, we see this extensively dotted sort of space here with sort of a cloud over top. This is interpreted as a cloud of grain falling from a wheat field. So that ties into that cult of Isis, who was attributed to agriculture in Egypt, and is why we believe that it may be a priestess goddess, or why it's theorized that this may be a priestess or goddess of the agricultural cult. Along her body, you may notice, and it is actually a little easier to see in this image, these sort of dots that are moving along in a pattern, going across her belly, across her breasts, along her bicep, even down on her legs here. These are believed to be sacrification marks, which is a type of scarring, a ritualistic scarring. And this ritual carries on into more modern day African cultures as well. Surrounding the central female figure, the large female figure, we see small male figures, all sort of in motion as well. But we also see this large figure right below her knee, or well, rather larger than the male figures here. This is a female figure. She's the second largest in the image, and she's interpreted as being perhaps a sort of shaman or priestess of this goddess figure, the large running horned woman goddess figure. Looking at sort of the dress that the goddess figure is wearing, these sort of armlets and fringed pieces and belt piece are all attributed to clothing that would be worn for dance. And so it suggests that the site and the objects in the site may fall outside of the realm of the everyday, leading archaeologists to further believe this could have been sort of a sacred site. At the time, the peoples of this area, hunters and gatherers, were unlikely to wear horns or other accessories on the head, um, further suggesting that this is a site of ritual or ceremony. I would like to talk about a little innovation that may, or actually will later become convention. Looking at the piece and the form of the piece, we can tell who the most important figure in this image is, and that's this large running horned woman, perhaps goddess. And definitely the size of the figure lends into that idea that it could be a goddess figure. We also see the second largest figure being this priestess here, and then the smallest figures of perhaps less important, the smaller men running along throughout the piece. What we're seeing here is a convention known as hierarchy of scale. This is the first time we are seeing it, though. The largest figure in the work is the most important, the smaller ones less important. Hierarchy of scale. You can put it under innovation and change because it's the first time we've seen it, but it will become one of our conventions and traditions as we move forward. The last thing I want to mention is just this image is sort of what this piece looks like in person today. At the time it was found, um, archaeologists and people who were sort of studying it found that it was easier to see when the rock was wet. And so they would keep re-wetting the rock so that they could, you know, view the image and the figure a little more easily. Unfortunately, it really damaged the artwork that was, you know, present on the stone. And so it really ties into um, ideas of art preservation and significant object preservation that's going to come up as we move forward in looking at our artworks. That is our last work for today. Again, this was a much longer video than hopefully we'll have in the future, but I wanted to make sure I went through each box and helped you fill in the content so that you had it categorized properly. If you have questions, please let me know tomorrow, and we will see each other soon. Have a nice day.